Hey everyone, welcome back to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. It's Nancy Miller, the host and creator of Dead Sleep, and I usually like to drop episodes on Wednesdays and Thursdays, but tonight's episode's a little late, and I'll tell you why. I got lost in this episode. I started working on it about a week ago, and I just fell deep into the research and then became obsessive about it being perfect. And as we all know, that perfection is the enemy of progress. And then I realized perfection is at the heart of what this episode's all about. The futility in our pursuit of perfection. And at best, it's the enemy of good. And at worst, it's completely self-destructive. And in the case of the story that we're going to hear tonight, it's about a woman who had an idea, an ideal in her head. And that led her to some dark places and into the hands of people who were themselves dark influences. Two grifters who promised someone perfection and then poisoned her with lies. And the consequences weren't just imperfection. The consequences were deadly. Because this is a story of a woman who deserved better, who deserved good, who didn't need perfect, and now deserves justice. And with that, let's settle in for the night. Get cozy, or as cozy as you can, if it's hot wherever you are. And let's put all of those expectations of perfection behind us as we close our eyes and get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. This is the Peach Emoji Murder Mystery. Do not do this, he begged. Please, this is crazy. Do not do this. That's what Carissa's friend would remember, begging her not to do what she was about to do. It was October 15th, 2019, just another bright and sunny day in Southern California. And in a nondescript house on a side street in Sherman Oaks, Carissa Rajpal was telling her friend not to worry. But her friend, a guy that she'd been out with a couple of times, told her it sounded dangerous. You know, this thing that you're doing, you should be doing this in a medical center with supervision. This isn't safe. It's just a shot, she said. I've done it twice before, she said. Don't worry about it. And she thanked her friend for letting her use his house. Around 2 o'clock that afternoon, two women arrived. An older woman in her early 50s and a younger woman in her early 20s, a mother and her daughter. Once they settled in, they set their things up in a bedroom and took Carissa and told her to lie face down on the bed. With them, they had hypodermic needles and a liquid, though the friend didn't know what that liquid was. Carissa had done this before, like she said, 2 times, and one of those times she even filmed herself and live streamed it on Instagram, so she knew exactly what to do. Then the women went to work. And what they did exactly, the friend of Carissa's didn't know. All he knew was that the women had injected Carissa with something, and within a few minutes, she started to lose consciousness. When the friend asked if Carissa was okay, the women said, "Oh yeah, she's fine." And they told him just to get something with sugar in it, a Coca-Cola or a piece of chocolate. But Carissa, she wasn't fine. She was actually unconscious. So the friend ran over and began giving Carissa mouth to mouth. Meanwhile, the women were packing up their things. As they packed up their things, he yelled to them, "You need to call 911. And apparently one of the women did call 911, and then they soon left the house, opening the gate for the paramedics when they arrived, then disappearing into the warm October afternoon. When the paramedics asked the friend what had happened, he had no idea. He only knew they injected her with something. He didn't know what, he didn't know how. And soon enough, she was whisked away into an ambulance and taken to the emergency room. At the emergency room, doctors were at a loss. What had she been injected with that had made her unconscious? Most of the time, when someone young came in, passed out, it was related to a drug overdose. And in fact, there had been a recent epidemic of fentanyl and methamphetamine ODs from people injecting those drugs into their system. But any attempts to revive her using some type of Narcan would have failed, because Carissa hadn't OD'd on drugs. And as they scrambled to find out what was the matter, they couldn't save her in time. Within a few hours of arriving at the ER, Carissa had lost consciousness, and then her heart stopped. Carissa suffered an acute cardiopulmonary dysfunction. It was actually the medical examiner who found out what had happened. When he was examining Carissa during an autopsy, he noticed there were puncture marks around her upper thighs and backside. And inside her body, there was a chemical oozing into her muscles and organs. And the chemical, he discovered, was silicone. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide. When authorities arrived, they realized what had happened to Carissa. She'd been given a back alley BBL. That's short for Brazilian butt lift. And the two women who'd come to give her the BBL had injected her with liquid silicone. And within minutes of having that liquid silicone injected, the silicone, which is toxic to a human body, went straight into her bloodstream and created a blockage, which gave her an embolism, which stopped her heart. So the police understood what had killed Carissa: a botched BBL. But who had done it? They had no idea. All they knew was what the friend knew. Two women came over, a mother and a daughter. They injected Carissa with something, and it killed her. Who these women were, where they came from, how many procedures they'd done in the past, they had no idea. At least not yet. But they did know one thing. These two women, they killed Carissa Rajpal. And they needed to be stopped before they killed someone else. The injections that killed Carissa, those took maybe 5 minutes. But getting to the bottom of what happened, that would take 5 long years. In fact, the case just was wrapped up a couple of months ago. And I'm honestly not sure if they got it right. But our story, well, Carissa's story, starts in 2016, when Carissa and her then-husband, Marco, moved to Los Angeles from Durban, South Africa. Marco told Rolling Stone magazine that they moved to LA for the sunlight, that Carissa was, quote, very weather dependent. She needed warmth and sunshine. But Carissa was in search of another kind of light. For some, it's the most precious and vibrant light of all, one that draws many, but shines on very few. The seductive, ever-elusive celebrity spotlight. The fast-burning, flaming Roman candle that is fame. The dream for Carissa was pretty specific. She wanted to be famous as an adult film star. And 2016, it turned out, was the perfect time. You might know the vintage vision of the porn industry from movies like Boogie Nights, Paul Thomas Anderson's homage to the grit and glitter of San Fernando Valley. Maybe that heyday was gone, but in 2016, when Carissa first moved to LA, the industry was making a comeback, thanks to some recent state legislation that brought adult film productions back to California. And on the surface, Carissa appeared to have it all. She was 26 years old, glamorous and fun, petite and hyper-feminine, like a modern-day Betty Boop, with wide eyes, big eyelashes, contoured makeup. And it was her doll-like look and on-camera charisma that drew people to follow her every move on Instagram. But in reality, despite all that sunshine, Carissa was actually depressed. And her depression was caused in part by a recent miscarriage that she suffered with her husband. And then one day, after moving to LA, everything turned around when Carissa fell head over heels in love with two sisters, two adorable pit bull puppies, and she named her girls Stardust and Diamond. The dogs brought Carissa enormous joy, and she devoted her life to her dogs and to promoting the pit bull breed. And through her pit bulls, Carissa met new people, other pit bull lovers, and through those people, she found a new social circle at local pit bull events. And according to Rolling Stone, she met someone at one of these events who knew of Carissa's desire for a career in the adult film industry and connected Carissa with an agency that hired exotic dancers for private parties. This was her way in. A 6-inch platform-heeled foot in the door to a bigger career. And as time went on, Carissa spent more time in the Hollywood scene. And as she did, she became more fixated on cosmetic enhancements. So she started having cosmetic surgeries, plumping up her lips, and attention soon focused to the other end, her butt. She wanted her backside to be bigger, rounder, the perfect peach emoji. Her husband blamed the Kardashians and all of the women like them who look plastic and fake. But Carissa was far from alone in her pursuit of the perfect peach posterior. The term BBL has been around for decades, but in this past decade or so, the demand for BBLs in the U.S. was at an all-time high. And the demand was so great, there weren't enough plastic surgeons to meet the number of people who wanted them, which contributed in part to the rise in illegal back alley BBLs and the rise in people who were being hurt, even killed, by these illegal butt jobs. And part of the problem was that this term BBL, it's a misnomer. The word Brazilian. Was the BBL actually invented in Brazil? The short answer is yes. The term BBL and the procedure is widely credited as being popularized by a Brazilian surgeon back in the 1960s. 1960s Brazil conjures up images of romance, passion, beach bodies, And this Brazilian branding, by the way, was no accident. From the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there was a social, political, and cultural push to promote the Brazilian body, the Brazilian woman's body, as the ultimate in feminine and sexy, with a tiny waist and outsized backside, enhanced by barely there bikini bottoms. But this Brazilian ideal was more than an aesthetic. It was its own form of eugenics. According to a fascinating piece in the Washington Post by Daniel F. Silva, a Black Studies professor and author of a book called Embodying Modernity: Race, Gender, and Fitness Culture in Brazil. Back in the late 1800s, after slavery was abolished in Brazil, the people in power in Brazil were white Europeans, descendants of Portuguese colonists, and they had a vision of the future of Brazilian people as European, meaning white. But at that time, the majority population in Brazil were of African descent. In fact, Brazil had the largest population of African-descended people outside of Africa. In the late 1800s to mid-1900s, eugenics aimed to improve the population according to elite white standards, which meant in Brazil that the white elites wanted to breed a new kind of Brazilian, one that was a mix of races, which they positioned as post-racial. On its face, it appeared righteous. But what they really meant was bodies that were less black and more white. And so they focused on deciding what the perfect Brazilian woman should look like, based on their own white Brazilian elite fantasies. The image that was promoted of the Brazilian woman was having light, tan skin, with straight hair and a narrow nose, but resting atop a curvy body with a tiny waist and a prominent, shapely posterior. This was positioned as a celebration of diversity, that Brazil was post-racial, but in truth, it was a strategic effort to colonize people's bodies, women's bodies, into an imagined ideal that would be seen as universally appealing, one that would become a point of national pride. Even promote tourism. Come to Brazil to see our beautiful, bronze, big-ass women. And more than 100 years later, that desired aesthetic endures. More recently, there are American celebrities who've popularized the peach emoji look, and that has its own problems. But on social media, influencers generate huge audiences through Instagram and TikTok, and revenue opportunities through sites like OnlyFans. With all that money and attention to be made, there are countless con artists who offer cheap BBLs through Instagram and trick people, especially women and trans women, into thinking this back alley procedure is safe and affordable, like a Botox party, but for your butt. And that's what makes BBLs so risky, which gets us to the butt part of the BBL. Many of us haven't thought much about our butts and what exactly our butts are made of, other than the fat part of our backsides that we enjoy for sitting. There are blood vessels and deep muscles, those gluteal muscles, those are in there too. And according to medical experts, some of those blood vessels are the circumference of a drinking straw, which means if someone inadvertently injects a foreign substance into one of those larger vessels, that toxin will hit the bloodstream, poison the blood, or block up the blood vessels like a pipe. And the reason why people don't realize that before they get a BBL is because of the most misnamed part of this whole thing, the L in the BBL. Because a BBL, it's not a lift. It's more of a filling. And when I say it like that, Brazilian butt filling, it sounds like maybe it's like a pastry piping bag, filling it with cream, like an eclair or a profiterole. Only with BBL, the filling is your own frosting, your own body fat. In the safe version of the BBL, adipose tissue, that's a sciencey word for fat tissue, is sucked from a fatter area of a person's body, like the love handles or flanks, then processed and re-injected back into the backside to make the area look bigger, rounder, and more even. But even in those safe BBLs, they're extremely painful and not dramatically effective. Adipose tissue, fat tissue, is soft and squishy like Jell-O, so it doesn't stay in place on its own. And once injected, it's often reabsorbed back into the body, and not exclusively to the booty. Fat deposits can move elsewhere, and where they end up can be unpredictable and asymmetrical. Sometimes one side is bigger or rounder, while the other side can look uneven and lumpy, like one half peach, the other half mashed potato. And that's the so-called good BBL. The bad BBL, the back alley BBL, what Carissa got. Oh, it's much worse. In the case of Carissa, the women who did this procedure didn't use Carissa's own fat cells. Carissa didn't have a lot of body fat anyway. As the medical examiner discovered, they used liquid silicone. And it's unclear if it was medical-grade silicone, which is illegal to use and banned by the FDA. But at least it would be medical-grade silicone and biocompatible. But if it was like most botched BBL cases, illegal practitioners have used industrial-grade silicone. That kind of silicone is used in all kinds of things. It's a soft solid, like toothpaste coming out of a tube. Industrial silicone isn't graded or tested to be biocompatible. And so it is potentially like putting caulk from Home Depot into a person's butt. In other reports, illegal BBLs were a mixture. Some of it was silicone, some of it a mix of motor oil, super glue, even peanut butter. For years, more than a century, cosmetic surgeons have experimented with injecting things into women's bodies. In the U.S., the area of focus for most of a century has been the breasts. Back in the 1800s, doctors injected liquid paraffin into women's breast tissue. Paraffin is a soft, solid substance derived from petroleum. And for a few years, they thought it worked. Then, much like silicone now, that paraffin created blockages and severely risked women's health, but the injections continued. Near the end of World War II, sex workers in Japan used industrial-grade silicone extensively. Barrels of industrial-grade silicone began to mysteriously disappear from Japanese docks, destined for injection into the breasts of what one article called enterprising ladies, catering to their potential clients. No medical records were kept by these women or any type of tracking of what happened to them after they did the injections. Industrial-grade silicone in these women's bodies in Japan likely caused all kinds of complications and likely even death. But it wasn't until 1965 that the complications from using liquid silicone would surface here in the United States. In the 60s, Dow Corning was marketing a new product they had called Dermagen. It was created to help waterproof the skin, primarily for burn victims. But early on, doctors were experimenting with it for cosmetic injections in patients. They were using huge amounts of silicone, sometimes pints of the stuff, from 5-gallon drums, and injecting pints of silicone into women's breasts. Not implants. They weren't encased in anything. It was injecting loose liquid silicone. This procedure became popular in Las Vegas in the 60s and 70s, where silicone was injected with great pressure using equipment resembling a caulking gun. These silicone injections in Vegas were known as Cleopatra's Needle. And in one piece I saw an estimated 10,000 women were injected with liquid silicone by 2 physicians alone in Las Vegas, beginning in the 60s until 1975. No records were kept on any of these women. But in 1975, the complications that was happening from these silicone injections in the breast was too hard to ignore. And in 75, the state of Nevada declared it was a felony to inject silicone or to transport liquid silicone across the state line. By the early 90s, the FDA officially banned the use of all silicone injection products by all physicians in any type of body contouring. So how was it in 2019? There were women still using liquid silicone and injecting them in women's bodies. Well, that's because the FDA can regulate drugs, but the FDA has no jurisdiction over the practice of medicine. So the agency can issue warnings, as they did in 2017, telling people specifically about the danger of the Brazilian butt lift and the ban of liquid silicone. But enforcing those bans, that was a gray area of jurisdiction, falling to local law enforcement, like the LA cops who had this murder of a young woman on their hands. So back in LA, authorities knew what had killed Carissa. As they dug into Carissa's contacts, they discovered that the woman that Carissa had met with, she was known as Latia, which means the aunt, or auntie in Spanish. On Instagram, Latia had roughly 10,000 followers. And at the time, in 2019, she was using Instagram to connect with potential clients and arrange for services. These services, police learned, were always in someone's home, never an office, and Latia only accepted cash. Carissa arranged for those 3 treatments with Latia for a total cost of around $3,500 a session. And for all 3 sessions, Carissa paid Latia a reported $14,000. That day in October of 2019, the day that Carissa died, when she told her friend she'd done the procedure twice before, this was true. And that 3rd installment was supposed to be her last. Why the silicone hadn't killed her the 1st or 2nd time was pure luck. Though it's possible, Carissa already had pieces of silicone in her body. Once injected, silicone becomes like tiny granules, like pebbles, that create an effect in the fat and muscle tissue. It's known as the snowstorm effect. In an ultrasound or X-ray, the area resembles a flurry of white flake-shaped silicone granules. Latia appeared to have a booming business online. But detectives wondered, was Carissa really their first and only victim? Or were there more? If they hoped to get justice for Carissa, they needed more information about who this Tia was, who her daughter was, and if she or they had ever hurt, even killed, anyone else. Latia was powerful, and she seemed socially connected, at least in parts of Los Angeles where she worked. Authorities released a public service announcement, asking women out there if they've ever had a BBL by someone named Latia, and if they had, to please come forward. And then they waited. Maybe there was someone out there. It took some time to find her. But there was finally someone who, after nearly a decade of keeping it to herself, was finally ready to talk. It was early 2014 when a woman named Laura decided to get a BBL. She was a singer of Mexican banda music. And a friend convinced her a bigger butt would lead to a bigger music career. So she went to see a woman named Libby Adame, better known as Latia. At the time, in 2014, Latia was working out of a beauty salon, and Laura knew other women who'd had the same procedure done by Latia, so she assumed it was safe. Latia also eased her mind by assuring Laura that she was going to inject her with stem cells, which made it sound natural, and made Laura feel safe. Laura remembered paying $2,000 or $3,000 for that session. The first visit, everything felt fine. After Laura went back for a second treatment, her leg started to hurt. The pain was getting worse and worse and worse, she told Rolling Stone in 2021. When she went back a third time, she told Latia that she was feeling badly, that her leg was hurting, and Latia injected her with something that she said was for the pain and for the infection, if she did have an infection. What Latia likely used to help Laura's infection was a liquid antibiotic smuggled in large quantities from Mexico called Kenzoflex. Kenzoflex is legitimately used to treat infections like UTIs and STIs like gonorrhea, along with more severe illnesses like typhoid fever, even anthrax. But if Laura did have an infection, she likely needed a round of antibiotics, not just one injection of Kenzoflex. A single dose wouldn't be enough to kill whatever kind of infection Laura had. So Laura's condition worsened, and her friend begged her to go to the hospital. But Laura refused. She didn't like hospitals, no doctors. She kept telling herself this thing would pass. But it only got worse. She was freezing, then sweating, then so weak, by the time she agreed to go to the hospital, she couldn't stand up, and her neighbor had to carry her to the car. At the hospital, she discovered she was suffering from septic shock. Sepsis is a serious condition. According to the Mayo Clinic, septic shock is the result of an infection, often a bacterial infection, hitting the bloodstream, causing your blood pressure to drop. And as sepsis worsens, it affects vital organs such as the brain, heart, and kidneys because they don't get as much blood as they should. According to the Mayo Clinic, the mortality rate for septic shock is about 30 to 40%. And once infected, septic shock can cause death in less than 12 hours. In a case like this illegal BBL, the infection likely came from unsanitary conditions, or from the material injected into Laura, which was probably silicone, not stem cells. Police soon discovered that the woman known as Latia, Libby Adame, and her daughter, Alicia Glass, neither one of them had any type of medical training. The only type of license that one of them had was in doing manicures in a nail salon. And yet, police found out that they'd been doing these illegal BBLs, and they'd made a lot of money. And even after the death of Carissa, the women continued doing their treatments. Eventually, over 100 people would come forward with stories about Latia and their illegal procedures. Authorities spoke with people in Miami and in Toronto, and they began to wonder if Libby's operation was much bigger than they thought. It took a couple of years to get everything in order, but in August of 2021, Latia and her daughter were arrested, and they were charged with second-degree murder in the death of Carissa Rajpal. And when they arrested them, they raided their house and uncovered a stunning amount of illegal material, including what appeared to be gallons of liquid silicone hidden inside bottles marked massage oil. It looks like enough material for 100 more BBLs. And with that, who knew how many more injuries or deaths? Both Latia and her daughter, they looked like they were recipients of their own procedures. Libby, who was in her early 50s, had pronounced cheeks, plumped up lips, and a figure that might be cosmetically enhanced. Likewise, her daughter had extreme features. She was only in her early 20s, but she appeared to have enhanced features as well, and a look that seemed a little uncanny valley. And looking at them when they were headed to court, the daughter in a hot pink suit, and the mother in tight jeans and a blazer, you wondered if somewhere in their own bodies, like their business, if there was a ticking time bomb. If they performed procedures on themselves like they did other people, it was only a matter of time. So the women were arrested in August of 2021 and charged with second-degree murder. Their trial wasn't until March of 2024. And what upset a lot of people during that time was the fact that Latia didn't seem remorseful or regretful of what happened at all. In fact, on her Instagram, she was shown eating a steak dinner and celebrating while she was out of jail. Both Libby and her daughter pleaded not guilty. And when their case finally went to trial in March of 2024, the fundamental question was this: was what happened to Carissa some tragic mistake? Or was it a reckless, ruthless murder? The prosecutor said murder, but the defense for these women said they'd made a terrible mistake, that they really wanted to help people and that they'd helped hundreds of women get the body that they dreamed of. And this was just a terrible mishap, one that they'll never repeat again. So which was it? That, of course, was for the jury to decide. Somehow, they earned the jury's sympathy. And so when it came time for the verdict, they were found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, a significantly lighter charge than second-degree murder. But there was still some potential prison time. So the verdict was one thing, and for many that was a disappointment. But it was actually the sentencing that was upsetting. And it just happened back in April of 2024. When the women appeared, again having been found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, they could have been sent to prison for years. And in fact, there were recent cases of other people who had done illegal BBLs in the state of Georgia and in the state of Florida. And in those cases, some of them received lengthy prison sentences. So what would happen to these two women? Well, ultimately, the judge decided to let them go. That the time that they'd spent while out on bail was considered time served. A sentencing that could have been 4 years in prison was essentially considered done and dusted. So Latia and her daughter, they walked free. And as far as I know, they're still out there. While researching this story, I tried to find out if they were still working, if they were still doing treatments. Neither Libby or her daughter are on social media at this moment in time. I wouldn't be at all surprised if these procedures were continuing. They're too lucrative, they're too popular, and they're too easy to be able to keep doing, largely without consequence. Now, Carissa's story back in 2021, when these arrests first happened, what happened to Carissa, it went viral, and the hashtag BBL was everywhere. But there's a difference between going viral and being remembered. Carissa's mother hoped that there would be one good thing that would come out of her daughter's death. That it's making sure that Latia and anyone who's doing illegal BBLs like Latia aren't allowed to do them anymore. And with any luck, someday soon, we'll all put this dangerous, expensive, and largely ineffectual cosmetic procedure far, far behind us. Thanks as always for listening and for the opportunity to experiment and stretch with the kind of stories that we tell on the show. There's a bonus episode coming out in a few days, so be sure to subscribe. Follow the show so you don't miss it. Until then, night-night.